Picture four teachers living in the same country in the same handful of years before the Civil War. They will never meet. Among them, they speak four different languages, and without knowing it, each one is about to make the same decision. In St. Louis, a formerly enslaved black minister named John Barry Meacham is teaching black children their letters in a church basement, and when the state makes it a crime, he will move the school onto a steamboat in the middle of the Mississippi because no one else will teach these children. In a parish in the Southwest, a Spanish-speaking teacher is holding a classroom in Spanish for Mexican children who are told that their language is a problem. On the California coast, in a hall paid for by Chinese families themselves, a Chinese teacher is instructing Chinese children the public schools have locked out. And in the Cherokee Nation, in the Southeast, teachers are educating Cherokee children in their language, in a nation that prints its own newspaper. Four teachers, each one chosen for the same reason, by communities that never compared notes. Because no one else would teach their child, they did. And if their children were taught outside of their communities, it was in a tradition designed to exclude their culture. And this is how ethnic matching became. Welcome to the cultural context of knowledge. I'm Donald Easton-Brooks. This is Season 3, The Inheritance Tax. Those four teachers were practicing ethnic matching at the same moment, in four corners of the same country, with no contact between them. That is the heart of this episode, and it is why I will not tell it the easy way. The easy way lines these communities up one after another, finishes the black story, then starts the Mexican story, then the Chinese, then the Cherokee, as if each took its turn. They did not take turns. They lived it together, in the same decades, under the same country, each through the particular shape of its own culture. So today we go moment by moment through the experiences all four shared, and in every moment I hold all four inside the same stretch of years. Listen for the simultaneity, because the simultaneity is the proof. No one of these peoples invented this. All of them arrived at it, at once, because it was true. Start with the decision that sat under everything else. In the decades before emancipation, the country was making one ruling, over and over, about whose knowledge was legitimate and whose was not. It enforced it everywhere at once, and it wore a different face in each community while doing the same work. For Native nations, and the Cherokee in particular, the ruling came earliest and most directly because it came with federal money. The Civilization Fund Act of 1819 set aside $10,000 a year and routed it to churches to run mission schools whose stated purpose was to replace native language and custom with English and Christianity. Within a decade, 52 such schools were running. The country did not deny the Cherokee child a school. It funded a school designed to make the child into someone else. In the same era, on the California coast, the ruling fell on Chinese families as a closed door. As the gold rush and the railroad drew tens of thousands of Cantonese-speaking immigrants through San Francisco, the public schools simply would not take their children. The exclusion needed no dramatic statute. It was the quiet, daily operating reality, and it would stay that way for decades, long before any court named it, and even after a court struck it down. Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 moved the border over 100,000 people who had lived in California, Texas, and New Mexico for generations. They did not cross into the country crossed over them. California's first constitution, in 1849, would print its laws in Spanish and English, but that was a publishing rule, not a promise of schooling, and it did not hold. The new public schools, built on an English-only model, told a Spanish-speaking child the same thing in gentler words: your language is not legitimate here. And in the slaveholding South, the ruling was written most violently into criminal law. After an enslaved man named Jemmy, who could read, helped lead the Stono Rebellion in 1739, South Carolina made it a crime to teach an enslaved person to write. In 1829, as David Walker's appeal moved through southern ports sewn into the linings of coats, Georgia made it a crime to teach any black person to read. After Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, Virginia declared every gathering of black people for instruction in reading an unlawful assembly. That law was a confession. You do not criminalize a thing you believe is powerless. Look at the four together. A Cherokee child handed a school built to erase her. A Chinese child turned away at the schoolhouse door. A Mexican child told her language was a deficit. A black child punished for a single letter. Four instruments, same span of years, same question answered the same way. Whose knowledge counts? Not yours. A community that is told its knowledge does not count has two choices: accept the verdict or refuse it. In the same decades, in four different cultures, the answer came back the same: refuse. Mexican families made their refusal by leaning into the institution the new state could not govern. They already had schools run for generations through the missions and parishes in Spanish. When the public system arrived to replace those, families turned back to the parish school. When a bilingual experiment in the Santa Barbara public schools collapsed in the 1850s, the Catholic Church opened a parish school there in 1857 for the children the public system had failed. In New Mexico, where Spanish-speaking families were the majority, the parish schools simply kept teaching in Spanish year after year, out of the state's reach. In the same years in San Francisco, Chinese families refused the closed door by pooling their own resources. Organized through the district and family associations, the bodies often called the Six Companies, they started language schools to teach the next generation in Cantonese, rooted in the classical tradition their families carried across the ocean. I will be honest that the record of these earliest schools is thinner than I would like, and I will not inflate it, but the shape is unmistakable, and it is the same shape as the other three. The Cherokee refusal was the most astonishing of the four, because they had already built, in their own language, the very thing the mission schools claimed to be giving them. Around 1821, Sequoyah, who could not read English, completed a writing system for Cherokee. 86 characters, one per syllable, so well fitted to the language that people learned it in weeks. Within a few years, much of the nation could read. In 1827, they adopted a written constitution. In 1828, they began publishing the Cherokee Phoenix, the first native newspaper in the country, in both languages. Beneath the printed word ran, "The older teaching no syllabary touched, carried in kinship, in ceremony, in the deep reading of land." And for the enslaved, refusal had to be hidden entirely. Lessons moved at night, in cabins and clearings, by the light of embers, a stick in the dirt for a pen. The same secret gatherings that held forbidden worship, the hush harbors, held forbidden letters too. And where free black communities could build in the open, they did. The African Free School in New York from 1787, the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia from 1837, with an all-black faculty teaching Latin and the sciences. Richard Allen's African Methodist Episcopal Church from 1794, building the organizational strength that would seed 1,000 schools the moment freedom came. So who did these communities put in front of their children? Not just anyone who knew the alphabet. In each case, and at the same time, they reached for a particular kind of teacher, and the reason is the same in all four. Among the Cherokee, the teacher who knew a child's language, kin, and relationship to the land was not adding a cultural decoration to real education. That knowledge was the condition that made the education real, because it was carried in the language the child already lived in. The teacher in a San Antonio parish in 1855 carried the same doubled knowledge in Spanish. By teaching in the children's own language, she taught, underneath the arithmetic, that the language was not a flaw to be corrected, and she carried the memory of a community annexed rather than welcomed, of property lost in courts that spoke a tongue The families were still learning. The teacher in a Chinatown Association school, teaching in Cantonese, made the same statement against the public system's verdict on whose knowledge counted, and the children in front of her did not have to spend the day translating themselves into someone the system would accept. And Frederick Douglass gives us the sharpest window of all into why it mattered. As a boy in Baltimore, he was learning his letters from Sophia Auld, a white woman, until her husband stopped it cold, telling her in front of the child that learning would forever unfit him to be a slave. Notice that the lesson itself came from outside the community, and it still mattered. But what Douglass would carry for the rest of his life was something more. The understanding of why his reading was forbidden, and that understanding lived most fully in the people who shared his condition. A teacher who had lived what the child was living could carry both at once, the lesson and the meaning of the lesson. That is the difference the match makes. Not that no one else can teach the child, but that the teacher who shares the child's world carries more into the room than the alphabet. A teacher who shares a child's world removes a cost the child would otherwise pay alone. Every one of these children could walk into that one classroom and for an hour simply be a learner, recognized rather than measured against someone else's default. This is ethnic matching in its earliest form. Long before it was a variable in a study, it was a recognition four peoples acted on under pressure. That a teacher who shares a child's cultural world brings expectation, trust, and recognition the child can feel. Not that race alone makes a good teacher. They chose carefully. They were not testing a hypothesis. They were protecting their children, and the protection and the teaching turned out to be the same act. There is a price under all of this, and the four communities paid it at the same time, each in its own coin. I want to name it plainly, because the season is named for it. Begin with the price the child paid, the same one in every classroom the official system ran. To learn anything there, the child first had to translate herself into a form the system would accept. Her language, her history, her family, her knowledge, all converted into the only terms the system counted as legitimate. That translation is labor, and it is exhausting, and it is spent before the first real lesson begins. That is the tax. The teacher who came from inside lowered it, because in that room, the child did not have to translate at all. Her knowledge was not a deficit to correct. It was where the teaching started. Then there was the price the communities paid to keep that teacher standing in front of their children at all. Chinese families paid in their own pooled wages and in a door that stayed shut for a generation. Mexican families paid in property lost and in the slow erosion of a language, in courts and classrooms built against it. The enslaved paid in secrecy and in the risk of the lash, in a school that had to float on a river to exist. And the Cherokee paid the steepest coin of all, a press seized by the Georgia Guard in 1835, and a nation marched west on the Trail of Tears in 1838 and 1839, which tore apart a working school system and a free press along the way. You do not seize a press and break a school system that does not matter. The violence was the measure of the threat. This is the inheritance the season is named for. Not only the knowledge these communities pass forward, but the price attached to passing it. And here is what I most want you to carry out of this episode. When the research finally arrived, generations later, and began to measure whether students do better with a teacher who shares their background, it was not discovering something new. It was catching up to what these four communities already knew and had already paid for in secrecy and property and blood. They matched the teacher to the child's world on purpose because they had learned it was the difference between a child who could learn and a child who first had to disappear. That cost did not end when emancipation came. It changed its shape. And that is where this season goes next. This week, hold the simultaneity for yourself. Pick a single year from this period, say 1850, and look up what was happening to two of these communities in that one year side by side. Then ask why your own education taught you at most one of those stories, and never the fact that they were one story. That gap is part of the inheritance, too. Next week, we move past emancipation, the promises of Reconstruction, the rise of the boarding school as deliberate federal policy, and the teachers who stood on the front lines of what came after. Freedom did not arrive into an empty country. It arrived into a country where these communities had already spent generations building, hiding, and defending an education that saw their children whole. Thank you for listening to The Cultural Context of Knowledge,